Amen. All right, so I have a little story about a friend I grew up with named Kyle, a high school friend. And Kyle is an atheist. And I became a Christian just going into my senior year of high school. And then we went to college, and I went south to the University of Texas, and he went up north to some fancy Ivy League school. And and so we kind of parted ways for a little bit. But then in college, we had a little reunion between him and me and a couple other high school friends. And so we all got together, did this big camp out kind of deal. We just had a great time. And we did campfire and hunting and just all that kind of stuff. Talked about everything under the sun, everything that is except Jesus. I wasn't going to bring it up. I knew we talked about it before. I knew he wasn't warm to it. I knew he wasn't comfortable with it. I just wasn't going to go there. But over the course of the weekend, I guess it was like the guilt just started to kind of like rise. Like, you have an atheist friend and you're not going to talk to him about Jesus. This is bad. And so this just started to build up. You guys ever had that? I call it evangel guilt. And so it was just starting to build up. And so, fortunately, for me, not for him. Fortunately, we had a long ride to the airport. What a wonderful time this would be to interrupt our fun time by intruding the conversation with Jesus that he did not want to hear about. And so, with the grace of a sumo wrestler on ice, I introduced Jesus into the conversation. And I love my friend Kyle because he's just very, very honest. And so I introduced Jesus into the conversation. I knew he didn't want to hear it, but I had some guilt I had to deal with. So I just kind of put it out there. And he looks at me and he says, Michael, we had so much fun, like all weekend long. You're so much fun to hang out with, but it's like I can see like something building up in you. I can see you like when you're about to introduce Jesus and you start acting all awkward, and then you just drop this awkward bomb on me. Like, I wish you wouldn't do. Why do you do that? And like to this day, I'm in awe of his artfulness in taking all the awkwardness that I had put on him and transferring it to me. So I got to feel what he felt when I introduced Jesus into the conversation. And honestly, I can't believe you said that to me. And so the conversation just didn't go that well. And I said, see you later. We're still friends today, by the way. Um, but let me just ask you for show of hands. How many of you have ever had an awkward spiritual conversation before? Anybody? Okay, yeah, a lot of you. Okay, now some of us, I bet you there are a few people in this room that maybe you've been on the receiving end of the awkward spiritual conversation. Maybe you relate to my friend Kyle, and you have maybe an awkward friend like Michael who just like bulldozed you like a Sherman tank with the gospel. I mean, I like steak, but it's not good if someone's shoving it down my throat. And so maybe you have felt that way, and you're on the receiving end. And I just want to say to you, if you're here and you consider yourself irreligious, that you're one welcome here, and I'm sorry that sometimes we Christians get all awkward like that and enforce the gospel upon you, but I pray and ask that you would not discount the message on account of the messenger. That we really do have good news, and I hope that by the end of our time together today, you can see just how good this news is and have your heart warmed by what we see as infinite love in Christ. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second would be for the Christ followers in the room, that there really is a better way, that we don't have to choose between the pain of awkwardness and the danger of silence. That there is a way of sharing the good news of Jesus, which the Bible calls gospel. There's a way of sharing the gospel that is not inherently awkward. We can do it naturally. And that's what I want to talk about today, is how to share the gospel naturally. Okay? We're in a brand new series called Contagious Love. And our big idea for this series, Contagious Love, is that the more we know the love of Christ, the more we'll show the love of Christ. And so it's a 3-week series, and over the course of these 3 weeks, you'll see that idea threaded throughout the message. And so all of the messages will have that idea running through them. And so that's going to be our focus today as well. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there, and if you don't, it's okay because we have the words up on the screen. But if you are turning there, I'm just going to kind of set us up with a little bit of context this morning. What is going on? Uh, this is the Apostle Paul writing a letter to a church located in Corinth, which is in Greece, actually, a city that's still there. And so he's writing this letter to Corinth. Now, at the time, it was not like he was like, I'm writing the Bible. It was just a letter, but now it's preserved as one of 66 books in the Bible. And so Paul's writing this letter, and the Corinthian church is what Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians 3 as spiritual babies. They're not very mature, and their immaturity comes out in the passage that we're talking about in the context leading up to it. The Corinthians have a dispute with Paul. And the dispute that they have with Paul is over whether it is okay to eat food sacrificed to idols in pagan temples. Now, this isn't really like probably you didn't come to church today being like, man, I don't know whether to go to the temple this afternoon and eat, pork in their temple. Like it's probably not a question that you have. But this is, as we'll see here momentarily, relevant for us. They originally asked Paul, is this okay? Paul gives them an answer that they don't really like. And the thing about this for them, because while it doesn't relate to our culture, like this was so embedded in their culture. I mean, it's like everything you celebrated, everything you did. It was basically the American equivalent of like going out to eat at a restaurant. That's just how they ate. That's just how they socialized. And so for Paul to say you can't eat food sacrificed to idols in pagan temples with them in the temple was the equivalent of saying don't go out to eat anymore. I mean, that's kind of what it was like. So they're kind of all in a tiff over this, insisting on their rights, their freedoms, their liberties in Christ to partake of this food. And so Paul has been resolving this dispute through chapter 9. And so that's where we pick it up in verse 19 to 23. And what we'll see is that Paul's opinion is that the Corinthians are wrong about their rights. Verse 19. He says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings." Okay, so here's, I know there's some things that we don't understand right off the bat. We'll unpack that. But here's how I want to go about today. I'm going to provide you guys with a little roadmap. Okay, and so our main message for this morning is going to be this, that the gospel is not just the message we share, it's our model for sharing. The gospel is not just the message we share, it's our model for sharing. Okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to break down this idea into two major points, okay? The first major point is going to be that the gospel models reaching people through a sacrifice of freedom. The gospel models reaching people through a sacrifice of freedom, okay? I think you have the wrong wording up there, but that's okay. You guys listen to what I'm saying and don't pay attention to the screens. The gospel models reaching people through a sacrifice of our freedom. And the second point is the gospel models reaching people through an incarnation of our message. So we've got a sacrifice of our freedom and an incarnation of our message, okay? So let's start with our first point. We got the roadmap. You ready to drive? Okay. Our first point, the gospel models reaching people through a sacrifice of our freedom. Let's go back to verse 19. I'm going to read this one more time. Okay, so he says, "For though I am free from all," so just that first part, "though I am free from all." What do you think the Apostle Paul means by this? Like he's not enslaved, like he's not in prison? What does he mean that he's free? He's been talking about this in 1 Corinthians 9 from the very beginning. He's talking about his rights in the gospel. He's talking about his Christian freedoms, about his Christian liberties. And in chapter 9, he's already listed 3 of them. And they all start with F in my categorizations. Okay, there's food, family, and finances. Okay, and so he has these 3 areas in which he's free. So for instance, in food. Okay, now are you guys familiar with what a kosher diet is? That's the Jewish diet, and it's rooted in the Old Testament. And so when Jesus comes onto the scene, Mark tells us Jesus declared all foods clean. In other words, because of what Christ did for us, we no longer have to abide by these Jewish food laws. So when Paul says, I'm free, I'm no longer bound by this kosher Jewish diet. Instead, I'm free to eat Gentile food. I can feast on a pork sandwich and nobody can say anything. So I have a right to eat whatever I want. Okay, the second thing he says previously in chapter 9 is that he has the right to marry a woman and to bring his wife along with him in ministry. He points out that that's what the Apostle Peter does. And he says, I could do that, but I've opted not to. Okay, so he's free to marry and to have a family. And then the third one is financially. He's free to receive payment for his ministry in the gospel. And he makes the point throughout chapter 9 that those who preach the gospel should make their living by the gospel. He says, I'm free to do all of these things. But then what does he say at the end of this verse 19? He says, even though I have all these rights, even though I'm completely free in Christ, he says, instead, I've become a servant of all. So what does that mean? What it means is, the very freedoms that the gospel purchased for him, he's now going to sacrifice, he's now going to lay down for the sake of the gospel, so that these things don't become a hindrance to other people. And so here's his point to the Corinthians. What he's saying is, listen, guys, the fact that he answers their question about rights, he answers their question about freedom, but he says, but listen, the fact that you're so insistent about this issue tells me your heart is not in the right place. Because when it comes to rights, it's really not about this like endless debate of what it's okay for me to do and what it's not okay for me to do. If we don't get past that conversation, we're missing the whole point of the gospel. Paul says, I have all kinds of rights in the gospel that I lay down freely. And he gives his reasons for laying it down. The reason he doesn't accept money from them, he's bivocational. He has another job in addition to preaching. Well, there were a bunch of gold diggers in Corinth, and he didn't want to be associated with them because he thought it would hamper the message of the gospel. And the reason that with food, he sometimes lays that down. Sometimes if he's ministering to Jewish people, he's not going to parade about his freedom to eat non-kosher diets in front of them because he doesn't want anything to hamper the message of the gospel. And so all of this, what it's getting to is this point that the gospel models reaching people through a sacrifice of our freedom. And I say the gospel models that because when Jesus was up in heaven, so for gazillions of years past, was there some sort of like ethical obligation upon him to sacrifice his freedom in heaven and come to earth? Or to become a human being and accept all of those limitations? Did he have an obligation to do that? Or did he have an obligation to lay down his life for us? I mean, even the phrasing, lay down his life. You see, the whole message of the gospel is that Christ willingly laid all these freedoms down for us. And so when Paul says, I lay down my freedoms for the gospel, that is, for the spreading of the gospel, he says, I don't do this because I have to. I'm motivated by love. And when you think about love, it always comes with a sacrifice of freedom. So I have a friend who used to be a youth leader, and at his particular church at that time, they were in this. They went out and they were like in this hotel, and all the youth were running around. They were doing things in the city, and then that night they stayed up late talking. It was my friend, and then I guess another chaperone who was with them, and they just, can you imagine teenagers staying up late? And they just stayed up late talking about all kinds of stuff, and then the conversation turned spiritual. And one of the teenagers asks my friend, so what does the Bible really say about alcohol? Like, is it okay? I heard Baptists say it's not okay to drink, and other people say it is okay. Like, what does it really say? And so he answers the question. He says, well, I think it's okay to drink, but you can't get drunk. And he goes into this, and they're like, another person's kind of like, okay, so if it's not okay to get drunk, like, how does God define drunk? Is it kind of like Texas .08 blood alcohol content? Is God like, oh man, you got the .081, like you sinner? Like where does God draw the line? And then like the next person trying, and then the conversation starts to shift toward like marijuana and Colorado, and conversation shifts again toward to dating and sex, and like how far is too far? Like, is it okay? Like, can we go to like second base, or do we have to pretty much stay in the dugout till we're married? And so like the conversation is like going in all these different directions. And my friend, he's like answering, fielding all the questions, but at the end of it all, he says, "Listen, guys." I understand, like, there's a place for this. There's a place for these kinds of questions. I'm glad you feel free to ask that. But if we never leave this conversation, like you've missed the point of the gospel. The gospel is not a message. Now, this is Michael talking. The gospel is not a message of just sin avoidance. It includes that. But really, religion is a message of sin avoidance. It's just do the right, don't do the wrong. But the gospel is a message of love. And love always requires a sacrifice of freedom. We see that in Paul and Jesus. We see that in any kind of love. If you're married, okay? If you're married, what would a loving marital relationship look like? Would you be like, oh man, they haven't cheated on each other today. That's a great marriage. Or is it a loving relationship where they're sacrificing their freedoms for one another? It includes the avoidance of those kinds of things, right? But it's so much more than that. Like nobody says, oh, that's a great dad. He hasn't beat his children today. They wouldn't say that because it's not just the avoiding. I mean, certainly if you're a loving parent, don't do that, okay? But it's more than that. Even if it's a love for your country, the men and women who put on a uniform, there's an incredible sacrifice that's involved with this. You see, the gospel is a message of love. And so what Paul is communicating here, he's saying, look at the way Jesus sacrificed his freedoms, the freedoms that he had. He didn't have to do this, but he did it anyway for love. And I have all these freedoms, but I'm not emphasizing them because I'll lay them down freely for love. And you Corinthians, you're all about just like, what's right, what's wrong, and just trying to get like as close to sin as you possibly can without crossing the line. And you've missed the point because that's not the gospel. The gospel is a message of love, which means it's a laying down of our freedoms for people who are far from God. And so a question I have for you today is, what freedoms are you laying down to reach people who are far from God? Do you see how the gospel, it's not just the message we share, it's our model for how we share it. Because in the gospel, we see Jesus freely laying down his rights. And there's just no way we're going to reach people who are far from God if we're not willing to sacrifice for them, to lay down our rights. It could be in the area of finances. It could be in the area of giving our time. It could be a million different areas. But how are we sacrificing to reach people who are far from God? Ray and Diana DeBoard are two pillars in this church, and Ray is an elder in our church, and both of them serve in a prison ministry called Kairos. And so they go and they visit these prisons and minister to the inmates who are there. And so that's just something they've done this as long as I've known them. Well, recently they came back with a story I want to tell you about a man named Guillermo. And Guillermo's story was this. Guillermo was in prison for 15 years. He was, by all accounts, hardened criminal, hardened heart to God, not warm to God, skeptical toward Christians, all the things that you would characterize of a person who'd gone just absolutely down the path of prodigal and beyond what most of us would imagine. And so that was his life. And in prison, that wasn't changing. And then the Kairos ministry started coming in and ministering. And so they put on meetings, but they also like counsel and meet with people and that kind of thing. And so Guillermo's story was that he just kind of checked out the Kairos meeting one day, and then he kind of kept checking it out. And then one of the guys who came through one day, his name was Bob. Bob was an 85-year-old man. An 85-year-old man with tons of like back pain. He needed a wheelchair just to get around, or if he couldn't use a wheelchair, he'd use a walker. And Bob comes and he visits with Guillermo, and they just talk for a little bit. Well, the way their schedule worked is after that little counseling or just friendship time or whatever you want to call that, relationship building, the inmate and the Kairos minister will often go to lunch together. Well, in this case, Guillermo's thinking this is for sure not going to happen because he knows that there's no way that Bob he can't bring his walker and he can't bring his wheelchair because of the rules against it. Security clearance, it's like prison brawl with a wheelchair. I mean, they can't. So he knows that Bob's not like how can he's not going to carry Bob, so he just kind of assumes it's not going to happen. So when he gets up and it's time for lunch and he thinks it's time to part, Bob insists on going. Bob says, "No, I just really want to go." And so, how are you going to go? Well, he walks. And in Guillermo's words, like he's literally like Bob's like 85-year-old man, like bracing himself, holding the wall, a long walk to the cafeteria, grimacing in pain the whole time he's going there. And finally, they sit down and they share a lunch together. And Guillermo says, "Bob, why did you do this?" And he said, "I just wanted to be with you." And that was the day Guillermo gave his heart to Christ. It's been years since then, and now Guillermo goes back into the prisons to repeat what he saw Bob do for him. Now, the reason I tell that story is, who could fault Bob if he just wanted to go home afterward? If he just wanted to go be comfortable in a recliner? He had every right to choose comfort, and he didn't. And how much more could you sacrifice freedom than to literally go into a prison? That's a whole other story. I mean, this guy sacrifices the freedom of his comfort, the freedom of his time, and using it however he pleased. Instead, at 85 years old, grimacing in pain, he is investing his life in people who are far from God. That's a picture of what I'm talking about here. And you see what happens when we do this. We're no longer just a megaphone, because, the church, like the world views the church basically as like one big mouth that tells them they're wrong and dumb. I mean, that's pretty much the image we have in the world. But when the church instead is sacrificially serving people, laying down rights for people, setting aside comfort and money and time, setting aside time in your week in the evenings to have people who are far from God over for dinner, and sacrificing the comfort of just having a nice and clean home. I mean, you can think of a million different ways to sacrifice, but when the world sees us doing this, it makes that conversation so much more natural. We're not just a megaphone. We're not just a mouth. We're not just alleviating evangel-guilt. We're loving people. That's what the gospel's about. So, the gospel is not just the message we share, it's our model for sharing, and it models reaching people through a sacrifice of our freedom. That's number one. Now let's go to number two. Number two, the gospel models reaching people through an incarnation of our message. The gospel models reaching people through an incarnation of our message. Okay, so I want to reread verses 20 through 22. These are a couple of the more confusing verses, and what exactly is he talking about here? And so let's read them and kind of talk about them as we go. Okay, so verse 20. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law. Okay, so though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. Now, that's actually kind of two ways of saying the same thing, because a Jew was, quote unquote, under the law. He's referring to the Mosaic law, the law of Moses, as outlined in the Old Testament, the 613 laws, which included food laws, which included laws about animal sacrifice, included all kinds of strange and crazy laws. Okay, Lord, I honor you, not strange, okay, whatever, but at least from our cultural perspective, okay? And so all these different laws, and so the scriptures teach we're no longer under that law of Moses, but now what the scriptures refer to as the law of Christ, which we'll quote in the next verse. And the law of Christ essentially, as you can find in Galatians chapter 6, is sort of spelled out. It's essentially the law of love. So it's more like the ethical and moral components of the Mosaic law stick with us, not the cultural components. Okay, and so what Paul is saying is this. He's saying, to the Jews, I will become a Jew. I will act Jewish. In Acts chapter 21, for instance, Paul shaves his head and takes a vow, which was very steeped in the Jewish tradition and in the scriptures. But he does it because he's going to Jerusalem, and he doesn't want people to think that he completely disrespects Judaism now. And so he goes out of his way to accommodate their culture, never accommodates the message. He never changes the content of his message, but the context does shape how he shares it. Okay, I'll say that again. The context never changes the content, but it does change how we share it. So we saw this in the case of the Jews, and now let's keep reading. Verse 21, he says, "To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ." Okay, so what he's saying there is, you know what, around Jewish people, I'll act kind of Jewish. I'll walk like them and talk. I don't know how you walk Jewish, but I'll talk like them. I'll quote their literature. And when I minister to Gentiles, it's going to be different. I'm not going to be all, like eating my kosher food over here, like, "Oh, you sinner, why are you eating pork?" And so I'm going to act Gentile around Gentiles, culturally speaking. And so that's what he's saying here. And then he says, "To the weak I became weak." And so we'd have to do like a whole study on this, but I'll just kind of save you that time and give you the conclusion of it. What he means by weak here, he's referring to those who have an oversensitive conscience and therefore are not very aware of all their freedoms in Christ. Maybe you have that, or maybe you've met somebody like that. It's like they don't feel like they can do anything. And so Paul calls that weak. He says, no, we really do have a lot of freedom. And so sometimes he categorizes Gentiles there, and sometimes he categorizes Jews there. But here's the point. Paul will adapt himself culturally to anyone, and he'll study their culture. I mean, Acts chapter 17, he quotes their poets and their philosophers. And so Paul will bend over backwards to accommodate culture, but he never changes his content, which is the gospel. Okay, and so there are a couple of ways, or I guess actually there are a million examples of this throughout history. One of them, has anyone ever heard of a preacher named Jonathan Edwards? Okay, so Jonathan Edwards, like father of the Great Awakening. And this guy, Jonathan Edwards, was brilliant. In fact, I've read of a secular author commenting on Jonathan Edwards, and he says, "This is one of the most brilliant people that America has ever produced. It's a shame that that his mind was wasted on theology." That's what the person says. So he's brilliant, okay? And so when he would preach to his relatively educated people, I mean, it was very like line upon line, precept upon precept. It was logical, inductive reasoning, he used what he had learned in classical rhetoric to preach to his people. But in 1751, he was after he was unceremoniously and unjustly booted from his church. Y'all never do that to me, please, okay? He left this role, and he went to be a missionary to reach the Native Americans, the Mohawk and Mohican tribes. And when scholars have gone back and they've looked at his sermons there, they see he had a completely different approach to ministering to them. For one, instead of just this kind of like logical reasoning, he spoke in narrative, because it was a storytelling culture, and the Bible, of course, was a storytelling culture. And so he just used the biblical narratives and preached in narratives and told a lot of stories. He used images and metaphors that they understood. And so he never changed his message, but he did allow that context to shape how he shared it. Now I'll share one story personally from my life, and maybe a little more contemporary for us. Okay, so a few years ago, when we saw in America racial tensions reaching an all new high, at least since the days of MLK and civil rights struggles. And so, but in recent history, I think everyone would agree, it's kind of gone to a new level, the tensions that exist in our nation. And as I started to see this play out, it broke my heart. And it broke my heart because of the gospel. The gospel is not just God's reconciliation to people, but people's reconciliation to people. And I wasn't seeing the church having any sort of constructive conversation about this. And in fact, I think this politically charged environment is, in too many ways, infiltrated the church, that it's hard to really think outside of our sort of political lenses and just say, what does the gospel say about this, and what does the scripture say about this? And so I was heartbroken over it all, but I also understood that as a white person, I really don't have that much of a grid or an understanding for racial injustice in our nation. And so I went on a journey, and I've talked about this a little bit before in our church, but I went on a journey that involved lots of conversations with minorities and just asking them pointed questions about their experiences, number one. Number two, reading literature by minorities, so that I was like hearing, instead of just reading a bunch of white authors, hearing that kind of voice and gospel-centered voices, but with that different perspective. And then three, reading lots of academic research on racial injustice in our nation. And after as I kind of went through this process, came to just the very firm conclusion that racial injustice was not just like slavery and Jim Crow. And nor is it just like today and those rare crazies that shoot people or the KKK. But it's every day from well-meaning people sometimes who just don't have the grit or take the time to listen or understand, and it can be white toward black or black toward white or any toward any. But at the end of the day, I came to the conclusion that racial injustice is real in our nation, and very, very real. And so in the midst of that sort of backdrop, I was in a doctor's office one day and struck up a conversation with the woman next to me, an African-American woman, older than me. And we just started talking, and it had just so happened that there had recently been a racially motivated homicide that caught the news's attention, everyone's attention. A lot of people were talking about it, and that came up in conversation. Now, kind of like old Michael would have probably like scurried along quickly past that, because I'm just gonna be honest that sometimes white people were a little uncomfortable talking about race, and maybe I would have done that, but I didn't. In fact, I let the conversation stay there, and actually went so far as to say something to the tune of, I said, I'm being a white person in America, I have to confess that I have no idea what it's like to be a minority in America, but I do know that it is hard in ways that I could never fathom as a white American. And I can imagine that you've probably suffered from some of that. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry that you've had to. Now, little did I know when I said that she had very recently suffered a racial injustice that if I was to tell you the whole long story, it would make your stomach sick. But her eyes just started to well up. Her mouth almost started to stammer a little bit. It's like she couldn't get the words out of her mouth. But when she did, she said, I've never had a white person say anything like that to me. Why did you do that? Why are you saying this? And I just began to explain to her what I just explained to you about the gospel, how the gospel pushes me. In fact, and if I could speak to white folks for a moment in the room, we kind of look past this, but the text that we've been reading, it's about race and ethnicity. He's talking about how he reaches Jewish people, and he's talking about how he reaches Gentile people. And so as white folks, because of the whole colorblind thing, we're like, I don't even see that. I don't see race. We just kind of look past it. We don't see it. But in Paul's cultural lens, this is what he's talking about. He's talking about crossing ethnic boundaries, going across the walls that exist. And there were strong walls between Jewish and Gentile. But Paul says, the gospel pushes me not to stay in my zone here. I've got to go across. And he's giving us his sort of missionary paradigm for why he does this. And so I think we as the church have to start asking these kinds of questions when it comes to race and ethnicity. We can't just be satisfied as a church not speaking into this situation and living out the gospel. But back to our story, by the end of our conversation, we were in a public place, and I usually don't hold women's hands in public places that aren't my wife, but she was well older enough than me that I felt like it was probably okay to hold hands and pray with. And it was a beautiful thing, because that day she gave her life back to God. But you see, it happens. Yeah, sure, there you go. But people have to know that we understand them. People have to know that we will meet them on their level. They need more than just a megaphone that shouts what our message is. They need us to actually live out this message. To live out this message. And the reason I say an incarnation of the message is this word incarnation is a theological term. It's a reference to God becoming human being. And so, and that's exactly what God did in the person of Jesus. And he lived, and he suffered, and he died. He wore our skin, walked in our shoes. I want to read you this quote from an author named Alan Hirsch. He says that the fact that Jesus was in the neighborhood for 30 years and no one noticed says a lot about God and how he engages the human situation. The incarnation thus shows us that God speaks from within a particular culture in ways that people can grasp, understand, and respond. The incarnation gives us the primary biblical model of engagement. This is how God does it, and we who follow his way should take a similar path. When people know that we understand them, that we're willing to do everything in our power to step outside of our normal comfort zone and to understand and to listen to them. Again, the danger in our culture, we're so politically charged, we can't listen to people anymore. But the gospel doesn't afford us the privilege of not being good listeners. We have to listen and perceive and seek with all of our hearts to understand other people, to meet them on their level. And to put this passage in contemporary American terms, this is what Paul would be saying. I want to reach whites, and I want to reach blacks, and I want to reach Jews, and I want to reach Asians and Hispanics. And to the blacks, I'm black. And to the whites, I'm white. And to the Hispanics, I'm Hispanic. And so we find out what those cultures are and engage those cultures from a position of understanding, instead of just pretending these issues don't exist or letting ourselves succumb to the politically charged atmosphere that we live in. The gospel is not just the message we share, it's our model for sharing. Incarnation is what we're talking about here. So let's summarize what we've said. A couple of points that are two. And so our big point, the gospel is not just the message we share, it's our model for sharing. But second, the gospel models reaching people through a sacrifice of our freedom. And then the last one, the gospel models reaching people through an incarnation of our message. So let me just drive this home with a couple of questions for us. One, I asked earlier, but I want to press a little bit more on it. How can you sacrifice your freedoms to reach people who are far from God? What freedoms might you sacrifice? Maybe it's like the 85-year-old man is just the freedom of your comfort, the freedom of getting to spend your time and your money and your energy the way that you want to. Maybe it's the sacrifice. You know, we went through this a little bit earlier, but I just want you to think about what sacrifices might you make. And then the second question is, how might I engage a different culture? How might I engage a different culture? This even goes down to the level of like parenting. You know, parents, if you have teenagers in the home, don't let yourself be the dinosaur parent who like completely doesn't speak. I mean, there's a degree of separation in the teenage years that's good and healthy and natural, but I think sometimes we just make it worse because we don't even try to enter into their world. Parents, when your kids were little, you would get on the ground and you would play Legos. You would meet them on their level. That's what we're talking about, incarnation of our message. But then when they become teenagers, we just throw our hands up and say, I just don't even get it. I can't go there. But explore, what would it look like to meet my teenager on his level or on her level? Maybe, I don't know, get a Snapchat account or something, but just find a way to speak their language and to meet on their level, okay? And I think probably one of the biggest for us in terms of engaging a different culture, engage a non-church culture. I mean, like, if nothing else, just do that. Because church itself has its culture. I mean, anytime people get together, there's a culture. You know, I talked about a doctor's office earlier. You ever go into the doctor's office and they have all this, like, doctor language, and they're like, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, I have no clue what you just said. And I even, like, sometimes watch doctor shows on TV, and I still don't get it. And so we Christians, we speak in our Christianese and we hang out in our Christian circles. But the bottom line is, if we only have Christian friends that we hang out with in our Christian circles and live by our Christian culture, then we're not living out the gospel, which tells us to go outside of that culture and engage lostness, spiritual lostness, those who are far from God. And so ask yourself these two questions. All right, I'll finish today with a story. Those of you older folks will probably remember this. Younger folks probably don't even know this story. But January 13th, 1982 is when this takes place. It was on a very, very cold day. And you could see what happens. Well, I'll get to that. Um, Air Florida, Flight 90, I believe it was. Yeah. Air Florida Flight 90 was due to take off out of a Washington airport. It's going south to Florida. And as it began to take off, almost as quickly as it took off, it began careening down into the 14th Street Bridge, killed 7 motorists on its way down. Does anybody remember this story? Okay. Continued careening down into the waters of the Potomac, the frozen waters of the Potomac. And so you see here a rescue effort at reaching these people. Okay, and instantly when the plane hit the ground, 73 out of 79 people died. But 6 people came out. And the plane broke up, and the tailpiece kind of floated away, and the 6 people were kind of just treading water around this tailpiece. But keep in mind, it's like absolutely freezing cold water. And so the rescue efforts come, and they drop the line down in an effort to save these remaining 6 people. The first guy, they extend a rope, he grabs it, they pull him away to safety. And of the remaining people, there's only one that really seems physically, mentally alert. And they drop the rope down to him because he's the most likely to have the capability of holding on to the rope. And so they drop the line down to him, but instead of taking it, he hands it off to the other person. And that person takes the rope, and the helicopter takes that person away. Helicopter comes back, gives it to him again. This happens over and over again until the very last person. He hands them the rope. That person is taken away to safety. The helicopter returns one more time to drop the rope for what Time magazine would later refer to as the man in the water, because they didn't know his name for a while. His name is Arlen Williams. That's him right there. They came back one more time to give him the rope, but by the time they came back, it was too late. The tailpiece had sunken down into the water and had taken him down with it. Now, the reason I tell this story is because Arlen Williams embodies what we're talking about today, because we live in a world where people are spiritually drowning. And if we want to reach them, it'll require a sacrifice of our freedom, number one. For Arlen Williams, there was nothing morally binding upon him to not take the rope. For one, the guy couldn't even, he had a lifelong fear of swimming, and he was engaged to be married. Nobody would have said, like, oh, I can't believe you took that rope for yourself. Oh, you're so selfish. Like, he totally could have, and it was within his ethical and moral bounds. But love is not just about right and wrong. It's a sacrifice of freedom. And so he sacrificed his freedom, and people are alive today. Generations are alive today because of it. And not only that, but nobody was more positioned or better positioned than Arlen Williams was to help these people to safety. The helicopter crew, they were way up in the helicopter. If the people were mentally incapacitated because of the freezing water, there would be nobody down there to help them. But because of Arlen Williams' situation, he was down on their level, so to speak. He was in the water in the same way. That's what Christ did for us. Christ sacrificed his freedoms for us, and he came to our level as a human being. Because in order to save us, he had to become human. In order to understand our pain and our struggle, he had to enter into our skin. And nobody is in a position to save others than the person who meets the people where they're at. You see, all of this is a picture of exactly what we're talking about today. And we all have a choice each day. We all have a choice each day. Do we want to be that man in the water who's sacrificing freedoms and who's meeting people on their level in order to save their lives, regardless of what it costs us? Do we want to be that person? I feel challenged to be that person, and too often I'm not. But I want you, me, Wellspring, I want us to be a church that will do anything for the sake of the gospel and helping people out of that water. Let's pray.